Yep, we're on. All right, let me explain the predicament first. Because there's always got to be a predicament, right? All right, so I'm doing my grandmother's funeral this weekend, so I will not be here on Sunday. Problem is, I can't find anyone to teach class for me. So, add another problem to the whole thing. Because the room is busted up and the elevator's broken, because, winter is a total disaster, that means this class is the only class that if people can't get upstairs, this is their only option. So I can't cancel class, because if I cancel this class, then Anita and others aren't going to have anywhere to go for class Sunday. So, unless I can twist anybody's arm to teach class for me, and I'm going to try the arm twisting tonight. I'm going to go around anyone, who's not teaching this quarter. I'm basically going to try to twist their arm to get them to teach class. I know it's last second. The other option, if you're all okay with it, and I'll take your input, it's perfectly fine with me. I tested it today, and it does work. Since I'm going to be in Oregon, I'm 2 hours earlier, which means I can teach class remotely, and it'll be early in the morning for me, and give me just plenty of time to get to church in Portland on time. And I tested it out today, and it does work. Everything works. So if you and I'll be able to hear you because I've got a microphone that'll hear you, and the webcast picks up all of you. If you would like me to teach from Portland and just have the screen, it works, and I'll teach someone tonight how to make sure it's set up and on Sunday morning. So just after class, just let me know. I really don't have a problem teaching remotely. It is perfectly fine with me if you're okay staring at a screen. So just kind of let me know what you think about that. I know it's not an ideal situation. I told someone this afternoon, jokingly, of course, gallows humor. I said, it's really inconvenient for Grandma to pass away like this, isn't it? But if we do that, I will make all of you do have to sit on this side of the auditorium, all kind of relatively close so that the camera can fit all of you in. Okay, so that is our predicament. For those who are not normally in this class, I'm glad you're here. We have been going through the book of Ezekiel. We're going to be looking at 2 chapters tonight because since we missed a class, we've kind of got to move things along here. So we're going to be looking at Ezekiel chapter 22, and then we're going to go backwards into chapter 18, okay? And this will cover lessons 7 and 8 from the book. So we're going to move forward. After tonight, we got to keep going. Otherwise, we're going to get behind and we won't be able to finish this quarter. So be prepared for lesson 9 on Sunday. Okay, so just kind of have that in the back of your mind. Maybe mark it in your book or something. Lesson 9 is what we'll be doing Sunday. Lessons 7 and 8 is what we'll be doing tonight, or at least the second half of 7 and chapter 8. So we'll be in Ezekiel 22 and 18, lessons 7 and 8 in your book. Let's start with a quick word of prayer and we'll jump right in. God, thank you so much for the warmer weather that we enjoy this week. We are so very thankful that our congregation has survived the cold weather relatively unscathed. We know there's a lot of damage to the building, but it is just a building and everything can be fixed. And we are very, very thankful that we have the means to do that. We know that there are many people around the world, even people in our own community, that don't have the same resources that we do. And help us to be sympathetic to them and helpful as we have opportunity, and also to be grateful for the resources and the abilities, as well as the skills and talents of our deacons who work so hard to get this thing up and running. So we're very thankful for all those things and so many other blessings as well. Please help us to have a great Bible class this evening. Be with all of our other Bible class participants and teachers tonight, especially be with our kids and help them to be receptive and open to the truth from your word. We pray this in your Son's name. Amen. Okay, so here in chapter 22, we are in the context of the sinful past of Israel and Judah. And how does the sinful past bring us to their present? Why are they in the situation that they're in? Well, they're in the situation that they're in not just because of the sins that they're committing currently or the sins that they committed just yesterday, but also because of the sins they committed 100 years before or 200 years before. And it's amazing how what we do right now does have reverberations or echoes right throughout time. Like how I'm living right now, yes, it impacts Rebecca and the kids and you to a lesser degree, but also how I'm living right now is probably going to have an impact on at least a few people 100 years from now. I mean, I can certainly say that about my own great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents, just looking back on my own family history, especially being really reflective this last week with my grandma's funeral and figuring out what I'm going to say about it. It certainly is something to point out when you had a 92-year-old, amazing, faithful Christian grandmother who showed you the example of love and kindness and the Spirit of Jesus in her life. Like, her life reverberated, and it will continue to reverberate. Now, for good, but also, as Israel and Judah show, for bad. Their sinful past had an impact on them. And it was an impact that even good kings like Hezekiah or Josiah couldn't permanently course correct. Like, for as great as Hezekiah and Josiah were, Josiah reinstituting the Passover, everything's great, we're tearing down the high places. And as soon as Josiah is done, what does everybody do? It's like from Emperor's New Groove. Remember when they said the emperor was dead? What does Yzma do? She said, well, he ain't getting any deader. And she immediately starts celebrating, right? Moving on. She's queen now. Like, as soon as Josiah's gone, everyone's like, y'all kept your idols, right? You just kind of put them in the back room. Josiah's dead. We can get the idols back out now. Let's go. Even Josiah couldn't course correct because that sinful past had that big of an influence on them. So let's get to chapter 22 and read a few verses, and then hopefully we'll be able to open it up for a little more discussion. I know I've kind of plowed on through the first 10 minutes or so here. So verse 1, then the word of the Lord, and also, I stop. We got to stop. Hey, 3 words in, we got to make a comment. No. If you like to mark in your books, and I know that this is also in your lesson book. The writer of our lesson book did a nice job of providing a little outline there near the end of chapter 7, lesson 7. He kind of outlines what these sins are. And if you like to mark in your own Bible, that'd be a good thing to mark. That just kind of underline this list of sins that are provided here in these first few verses. So take a look at verse 2. And you, son of man, will you judge? Will you judge the bloody city? Then cause her to know all of her abominations. That's tough, isn't it? I think God challenges us to do the same thing. God looks at us as Christians today in a culture that I think we can acknowledge is often very hostile to our faith. And I think God challenges us and says, you want to speak the truth? Where was it just a moment ago when the slides were, cycling through up on the screen? What's our theme for 2024? Preach the word, in season and out of season. I think God will look at us like he looks at Ezekiel and says, that's easy to say. Are you going to do it? Okay, Ezekiel, you going to judge the bloody city? You want to judge the bloody city? Okay, here's what I need her to know all of her abominations. Cause her to know all of her abominations. Like, we can put it on a poster. And put it on a very well-designed poster, if I might add. Somebody put a lot of thought into the visual, of our theme this year. But you can put it on a poster, and it looks great. Preach the word. And I think God would say, okay, Ezekiel, you want to preach the word? You going to preach the hard stuff too? You going to preach the tough stuff also? All right, cause her to know all of her abominations. And you shall say in verse 3, thus says the Lord God, a city shedding blood in her midst so that her time will come, and that makes idols contrary to her interests for defilement. You've become guilty by the blood that you've shed and defiled by your idols that you have made. Thus you brought your day near and have come to your years. Therefore I have made you a reproach to the nations and a mocking to all the lands. And that is exactly, by the way, what he said in the book of Deuteronomy. That's exactly what he said. Back in Deuteronomy, if you follow me, then I'll bless you. But if you don't follow me, I'll curse you, and you will be mocked by the nations around you. That is exactly what he told them would happen. Verse 5, those who are near and those who are far from you will mock you. You of ill repute, full of turmoil. Behold, the rulers of Israel, each according to his power, have been in you for the purpose of shedding blood. They've treated father and mother lightly within you. The alien they have oppressed in your midst. The fatherless and the widow they have wronged in you. You've despised my holy things and profaned my Sabbaths. Slanderous men have been in you for the purpose of shedding blood, and in you they've eaten at the mountain shrines. In your midst they've committed acts of lewdness. In you they've uncovered their father's nakedness. In you they've humbled her who was unclean in her menstrual impurity. And one has committed abomination with his neighbor's wife. Another has lewdly defiled his daughter-in-law. And another in you has humbled his sister, his father's daughter. In you they've taken bribes to shed blood. You have taken interest in profits. You've injured your neighbors for gain by oppression. And I love how he ends it in verse 12. Almost as if to say, if that's not all bad enough, you've forgotten me. And that's how he ends it. As if all that wasn't bad enough, you murderous, slanderous, adulterous people, you forgot me. You've forgotten me. Okay, so like I said, there's an outline there in your material that kind of gives this list of sins. What do you think? I know this is a kind of a vague question, so I'm sorry. I like vague questions because I know there's a lot of places you can go with it. Hopefully some discussion. In this list of sins, what stands out? Are there any sins in particular that stand out? Does there seem to be a pattern? Does this list of sins remind you of anything, any other passages in the Bible? What stands out here in verses 1 through 12 of this list of sins that's offered? Okay, I think Phil, that's a good point. Like, they seem to get worse. And it's like, as soon as you think, like, is that all? There's something else that gets thrown in there. And I mean, by the end of the list, were you getting a little uncomfortable in there? I was. You start getting to the list like, okay, all right, so they practiced idolatry, and then they stole from each other, and then they committed acts of lewdness. You're not going to be specific, are you, God? Oh, no. Oh, you're going to be specific. Oh, okay. Menstrual cycles. Daughters-in-law. Oh. Wow, you really went there. Yeah, you did. Yep, God did. By the end of it, it becomes a really uncomfortable passage to read. Like a lot of things we've studied in Ezekiel already, this Ezekiel is a book that'll make you squirm in your seat a little bit. And this list really does make you squirm a little bit in your seat. It's very uncomfortable. What else do you notice about this list of sins? Verse 8, that one stands out. You've despised my holy things. You've profaned my Sabbaths. Yeah, that's a good... So when God looks at sin, God isn't just looking at what we do to each other, because that's bad, right? Murder, adultery, coveting, that sort of thing. Those are bad sins. We do them to each other, but God also says, and you've also sinned against me. You profane my holy things. You've not kept my Sabbath day. I take idolatry as a personal betrayal. You've forgotten me. So I think it's interesting how mixed in with all of these sins that people do to each other, God also includes, kind of mixed in there, the sins that you're doing to him as well. So I think it's good point, Kurt. Good point. Yeah, Karen?
It's probably just a no-brainer, but most of those relate somehow to the Ten Commandments.
That was one of the things I was going to say, if nobody else was going to catch that one. Yeah, I don't know. I didn't run it myself. But I think you could probably find all 10 commandments in there. Maybe not word for word, but you could fit them in. I mean, specifically, I don't see taking God's name in vain specifically. That might be the only one that I don't find in there. But certainly there's the adultery is included in the acts of lewdness. There's lying, there's murder, covetousness for sure is in there. He specifically points out that you're not honoring your father and your mother. I believe his words are in verse 7, you have treated father and mother lightly within you. I think what he means by that is you don't respect your father and your mother. You treat them very lightly. There's no weight or substance to your relationship. You just don't have any respect or honor for them. Certainly, there is not keeping the Sabbath day. There's idolatry in there. So you really could list pretty clearly all 10 of the commandments in there in some shape or form. So that was what I was going to notice also, if nobody else was going to point that out. Yeah, so it's uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable. And to me, I don't know why it just stands out so much. The way that he ends it there in verse 12, and you have forgotten me. That's the punctuation mark at the end of this long list is you have forgotten me. And maybe if they had not forgotten God, a lot of these other sins might not have ever been a problem. Yeah, Mackenzie?
I think a lot of times today we get so caught up in the world and we see the news and we see all these horrible things that are happening and we like to be like, woe is me, I live in this horrible, sinful time.
Mm-hmm.
But I think reading scriptures like this reminds us that these sins have been around the whole time.
Yeah.
From the beginning, and what they were dealing with, we're still dealing with, and it's not new to God. And he was able to point it out, bring it to the forefront there, and we saw the consequences of their actions then. So I think that it's just really important for us to recognize that what we're going through now and what's going on around us is not new.
Yeah.
It's not something that God hasn't seen before and that he can handle.
And I think that, to go along with that, this list of sins is also, there aren't a bunch of archaic things in here. Which, you look at history and you can talk about art, music, apparel, standards of dress, style, languages, ancient languages, dead languages that nobody even speaks anymore. There's a lot of stuff from the past that is very much couched in the past. Built 1,000-year-old buildings that are just rubbles and ruins now. And yet you read a list like this and you go, man, a lot has changed in 2,500 years. But you know what hasn't? Sin. Basically, sin back then is sin now. Acts of lewdness, maybe they look a little different. They're packaged a little bit different. Acts of lewdness, disrespecting your father and mother, having an idol in your life that runs your life, coveting, taking advantage of people in your businesses. This is a list. You could read this now, and this is not a 2,500-year-old list of sins. Rebecca? Yeah.
Pointing out the sins within the churches as well. So it's easy to be like, oh, those poor sinful Israelites, they just never got it. But then you look at Revelation and you say, oh wait, no, those guys still never got it.
Yeah.
And then you can go, okay, well, what do we have going on amongst us? We're still not getting. It's not new. It just keeps coming.
Yeah. And that actually makes for a really good companion, which we'll get to chapter 18 in just a minute, because we got to get there. We got to save time for chapter 18, which is a very cool chapter. But chapter 18 shows the cycle, that people get stuck in of sin. And the only way to break the cycle is just to be an individual. Don't just do the same things your dad did, your mom did. You have to be someone who stands on your own two legs, spiritually, faith-wise, morally. The only one who can break the cycle is you. And it has to start with you. And you have to take responsibility for yourself. Otherwise, we're just the next chain in this, we're the next link in this long unbroken chain of sinful people from Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel to the time of Noah all the way to today, basically all just committing the same sins. And God points out in chapter 18 very clearly, I want you to break that cycle. If you're a sinful person living in your sins, break that cycle, learn, grow, become righteous. And the sinner who repents of his righteousness will live, and I'll regard him as righteous. And then, of course, the opposite is true, which, again, we'll get to in just a sec. Before we move on to chapter 18, let's skip on ahead down to the end of chapter 22, because there's a really neat idea that I want to just kind of introduce it. I want to just sort of throw it out there, talk for just a minute, because it's going to be the basis for a lesson when I get back in a couple weeks, when I preach again. I don't mean I'm going to be gone for a couple weeks, but the next time I preach. But I want to introduce it just here because it's in our Ezekiel class. So let's go down to verse 28. Let's go to verse 28 and read through the end of the chapter here. And her prophets have smeared whitewash for them, seeing false visions and divining lies for them, saying, "Thus says the Lord God," when the Lord has not spoken. Oh, that's a whole sermon on its own, but that's not where I was going with that. The people of the land have practiced oppression and committed robbery. They've wronged the poor and needy and have oppressed the sojourner without justice. Verse 30 is really the centerpiece of this. That really stands out. And so I searched for a man among them who should build up the wall and stand in the gap before me for the land, that I should not destroy it. But I found no one. Thus I've poured out my indignation on them. I've consumed them with the fire of my wrath. Their way I have brought upon their heads. Go back a few pages, chapter 13, verse 5. He uses the same kind of language in chapter 13, verse 5. You have not gone up into the breaches, nor did you build the wall around the house of Israel to stand in the battle on the day of the Lord. Okay, so standing in the breaches or standing in the gap, that's a phrase that you see sometimes used in like Christian literature. There's a lot of books that are about that, about standing in the gap for your faith. Stand in the breach, or I look for someone who might stand in the gap. What does it mean when someone stands in the breach or stands in the gap? What's the kind of like historical context to that phrase? Looking for a leader, yeah. And literally in what sense, right? We need a leader to do what? What does it mean to stand in the breach?
Fill in the space where the enemy's going to get through.
That's right. You're living, all these towns and villages were walled, okay? That was, if you did not have a wall around your town or village, you were just a sitting duck and you were asking for it. You were asking for some raider or marauder to come along, some Philistine band to come and steal your stuff and take your children. So every town, every village, every relatively, by their standard, large city had a wall and a gate. And your wall was your first and last line of defense against trouble. But if a part of that wall broke down, maybe they were slinging stones at it. They did have siege engines back in that time. They could sling stones. So maybe they tear part of that wall down. Someone needs to get in that gap and defend that part of the wall, to put his own life or her own life in danger, to be the wall. In the place of bricks and stones and mortar, your own life becomes the wall, and you stand in the breach to protect your city. It's always like that scene. There's a movie that came out a number of years ago called Kingdom of Heaven, about Jerusalem and the Crusades. It had Orlando Bloom. A wildly historically inaccurate movie, just to be clear about it. But I thought a really, really good movie. I thought it was really, really cool. And the wall of Jerusalem finally gets breached by Saladin, and Orlando Bloom's character stands in the breach. And he says, we're going to defend Jerusalem to the last man if that's what it takes. And he literally stands in this gap in the wall of Jerusalem and defends it. I won't ruin the end of the movie for you. Again, absolutely not based on history. So if you know any history about Saladin, it's not true. But I love that idea. It's so visually captivating. And I love that God draws such a vivid picture There in chapter 22, verse 30, I looked for someone who could stand in the breaches, and I didn't find anybody. Basically, he's saying, I looked at Jerusalem in all of its sin and all of its turmoil, all of its evil and corruption, and I looked for just one reason to not destroy them. Just one. I need one man in this city who will give me a reason to stay the hand of judgment. And I didn't find one. So I poured out my wrath. It's very much Sodom and Gomorrah, isn't it? When Abraham is saying, well, let's say there's just like, if there are 10 righteous people in the city of Sodom, will you stay your hand? And God says, yeah. For 10 righteous people, of course I would. I'd withhold judgment on Sodom. He's looking down at Sodom going, give me a reason to not destroy you. Just give me one reason to be patient with you a little bit longer. And with Jerusalem, that was it. There were no more reasons. There was no more excuses. Okay, let's go to chapter 18 now. Chapter 18. Go ahead, Phil.
When he says in verse 31, I have poured out my indignation on them, I have consumed them with the fire of my wrath.
Mm-hmm.
Is that fire, or is that, what is the fire? Is that literal, or?
Well, in a sense, it would be literal, yeah, because, the city was utterly destroyed, and so certainly the Babylonians would have used fire. But I think in that case, right here, he's speaking metaphorically. The fire of my wrath, that God's wrath, I think what he means is God's wrath is a genuine kind of wrath. You know, there's feigned wrath, like when your boss has to discipline you, but your boss isn't really mad at you. We were watching a show recently where ordinary people were taken through special ops training. Like they were thrown into the fire and said, "You're ordinary. You want to see what it means to be special ops? Okay." And there was one of the special ops trainers that had to lay down the law about something. And I won't get into the specifics of it, but he put on the biggest act. And Rebecca and I both were like, he's not really that angry. He's just trying to prove a point. But you can tell when someone's kind of just putting on a show, for the camera, versus when someone's really mad. And I think with God, when he talks about it, it's the fire of my wrath, this fiery indignation that I have. What he's saying is, this is not show. This isn't posturing.
Did he destroy the people, or?
Yeah. Well, destroyed the people through the medium of Babylon, right? The tool that he used was Babylon. Yeah. So I think you could say it was literal in the sense that, yeah, Jerusalem literally did get consumed by fire. But I think he's speaking more metaphorically here, that his wrath is a fiery, genuine, deep kind of wrath. And it's not just for show. God's not just posturing. He's not just talking. That it's real. It's hot. All right, chapter 18 now. So it starts off with this proverb that bothers God. It irks God. And this isn't the only time, by the way, that this proverb comes up. You get it from Ezekiel's side of things. And Ezekiel's in Babylon by the river Chebar. He's not in Jerusalem. But Jeremiah talks about that same thing too. There's a reference in Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 29 and 30, where the same proverb gets brought up, and God's like, will you quit using that proverb? So somebody, say the proverb. What is the proverb? Somebody just say it for me.
Father's eating sour grapes and children's teeth are set on it.
What does it mean? What does he mean by that? What does this proverb mean?
It's not my fault. It's my dad's fault.
Yeah, it's not my fault. It's my dad's fault. All the problems in my life, they only happen because of my dad. If my dad hadn't been such a whatever, if my dad hadn't made all those mistakes, and now here we are, we're the children. The dad ate the sour grapes, but you know whose teeth are set on edge? Us. Me. I'm paying the penalty for all the mistakes my dad made. And it's a way of deflecting the blame, isn't it? all your problems, it's always someone else's fault. And again, it's like we pointed out a minute ago. This is not 2,500-year-old stuff. This is like today stuff. This is human nature type stuff. It's always someone else's fault. You get in trouble for something at work. Well, he didn't send me the fiscal reports on time. Or, oh, I misplaced your email address. Or, oh, I had my phone with me at the time. Or, well, you needed to talk to Hanson over there. That was Hanson's job to get the... It's always someone else's fault. It's pulled over by the police. Sir, you know why I pulled you over? Well, my kids were being real noisy in the back seat. Or, listen, officer, I've been under a lot of stress lately. Got a lot of stress at home, and I know I shouldn't have done that, but man, my wife's just driving me crazy. It's always someone else's fault. And that's what this phrase, this proverb is all about. And they said it to comfort each other, like, yep, there you go. Hey, heard your business got ruined. Yeah, me too. Yeah, did you hear, you hear about their son? Yeah, the son got killed by some Babylonians. There it is again. Dad ate the sour grapes, and it's the kids' teeth set on edge. They probably just said it to just deflect all the blame, all the responsibility. And what's God's opinion on this in verse 3? Yeah, it's Bob Newhart. There was a skit one time where Bob Newhart was a therapist, and he just charged by the minute because he said this won't take very long. And this woman explained all of her problems. Well, I have all these thoughts and this self-doubt, and I have an eating disorder, and what am I supposed to do? He said, well, this won't take long. Stop it! What, Doc, what do you mean? Is that stop it? Just stop it! Of course, if you know anything about Bob Newhart, the comedian, in his droll sort of way, it was a very, very funny sketch. But that's, God's answer is, as I live, stop saying that proverb. Stop it. We're done with that. We're done throwing the blame around. Got to take some personal responsibility. So he proceeds then with essentially the rest of the chapter to lay out this incredible argument, this diatribe really on people who toss personal responsibility out the window and deflect blame onto everybody else. It's always someone else's fault. And he says, let's be clear about this. And I'll sum it up and then we'll look at some of the details together in just a moment. Let's be clear about this. If there is a man out there who practices righteousness and he obeys the law and he loves the poor and he takes care of widows and strangers and orphans and he refrains from participating in idolatry and eating the things that have been sacrificed at the high places, and he lives for me and keeps my Sabbath day holy, that man is righteous and he'll live. But let's say he has a son, and I know I'm getting this in the reverse order. I understand that. I'm just summing it up here. He has a son, and that son doesn't listen to him, and he doesn't follow after his good example, and that son disobeys the law and does not regard the Sabbath as holy, and he does not care for the orphans, the poor, and the widows, and he takes advantage of them instead. That man is wicked, and he'll die in his wickedness. In fact, he says, surely he shall die because of his wickedness. And so in the end, it's, as God very clearly points out, I think in verse 20 to me is kind of the heart of it here. If you want to sum up the chapter in just one verse, it's verse 20. The person who sins will die. The son will not bear the punishment for the father's iniquity, nor will the father bear the punishment for the son's iniquity. The righteousness of the righteous will be upon himself, and the wickedness of the wicked will be upon himself. And so that to me that's the chapter in a nutshell. Now we've glossed over a great deal of details in there that are certainly noteworthy. So let's talk about a few more things. First of all, any thoughts up to that point? You want to throw anything out there, kind of big picture stuff, whole chapter comments, or are you ready to look at some detail here? Certainly, I don't want to just plow on through if you've got any thoughts on that. First of all, I think it's interesting, the kinds of sins and righteous deeds that he lists off are very much parallel to what we read in chapter 22, aren't they? You have moral things, whether it's morality and how he keeps himself morally. You have, such as verse 6, defiling his neighbor's wife or approaching a woman during her menstrual period. That's the same language as in chapter 22. Right? He pointed that out, that taking advantage of a woman or your neighbor's wife, your daughter-in-law, or a woman in her menstrual period, that's the same language. So I think it's interesting how there's clearly a parallel of the lists in verse 22, or chapter 22, and the lists of righteous deeds and unrighteous deeds in this chapter as well. It's moral things, it's civic responsibilities, like taking care of the poor. If you have the means to do so, you better be taking care of the poor. You have a civic and a religious responsibility to do that. And it's also religious duties to God. Are you regarding holy things as holy? Or are you going up to the mountain shrines and lifting up your eyes to the idols in verse 6? So I love that there's that parallel of what God considers to be righteous versus unrighteous. There's a uniformity, right? Chapter 22 says this. Chapter 18, going to say the same thing. You want to know what it means to be righteous? You can know what righteousness is. It's identifiable. Okay, what other stuff stands out to you? Go ahead, Karen.
I don't know who brought this out or if I just happened to see it, but there's another proverb, it seems like, that toward the end.
Yes.
The Lord is not just. They were blaming God.
Yeah.
God's the problem, not us.
Yeah. Yeah.
Verse 25.
In verse 25, yet you say, the way of the Lord is not right. That's how New American Standard puts it. New American Standard adds a little bit of a whininess to it, isn't it? The way of the Lord is not right. I think that, New American Standard includes in there. Yes. It's in the ancient texts. You can look it up. The way of the Lord is not right. Hear now, O house of Israel, is my way not right? Is it not your ways that are not right? I like how God what I love about that verse is that God is going to play at your own game. If you're just going to say something categorical without any proof whatsoever, well, God's ways aren't right. What's God's answer to that? No, your ways aren't right. Right? It's you want to play that game? You want to make totally unsubstantiated claims against me? Well, fine. No, your ways aren't right. And it very much reminds me of in the Gospel of Matthew when Jesus is having all these debates with the Pharisees and Sadducees, and they're asking him questions. He says, I'll tell you what, I'll answer your questions if you answer one of my questions. Where did John get his authority? From heaven or from men? We don't know. Well, then I'm not going to answer your questions. It's God's going to play your game. If you want to play games with God, he's going to go, don't play games with me. Don't play games with me. And I love how he just flips it around and says, no, it's your ways that aren't right. Okay? Yeah, I love that, Karen. Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. That's a great verse. And I'm not sure we would have had time to get to it by the end of class. So I'm really glad you pointed that out.
In James Version, it says equal instead of righteous. Instead of right, it says that God's way is not equal.
Huh, that's interesting. God's way is not equal. Hadn't thought of it in those terms. Maybe it's kind of the idea of unfair. Like God's ways are unfair; they're not equal. Like the scale. They're saying his scales aren't balanced. He's unfairly judging. He's unfairly treating. His scales are not properly calibrated. So that's probably kind of the idea of being not equal. Yeah, I like that. That kind of adds a little different flavor to it. I like that. Thanks for pointing that out. Okay, now the obvious question from all of this is, does a parent feel this responsibility? You know, let's say this righteous parent comes along and has an unrighteous child. And I don't bring this up in any way because I know that there are people in our own congregation who, like, this is their life. Like, their life and their family life is there's an unfaithful child. Perhaps even wildly unfaithful in their moral and spiritual behavior. And that's tough. Like, I'm not living that right now. I've got a lot of cousins who I get to spend the weekend with. By the way, cousins I haven't seen in 15 years because they fell away and left the faith. Cousins who were he's 15 years ago and are now she's. So even though it's not my child that has fallen away, in my own extended family, I know on some level what it is to have people fall away. I think it's interesting how in all of this, God kind of cuts through the sentimentality, and he wants to be very clear here. If you are righteous, you're righteous, and I see you. And I see you. And I don't blame you. When your son or your daughter falls away, when they want to live their own life, when they're the prodigal son in a faraway country, spending and living luxuriously and wanting pleasure, I see you. I love it how this chapter is clear that God does not just look at us as, oh, Ryan Goodwin? Oh yeah, you're the failed parent. I remember you. God doesn't see us that way. He doesn't drape this around our neck as this responsibility of like, yep, you're the parent that your kid fell away. Yeah, no. If you're righteous, then you're righteous, and I see you, and I have promises that I'm going to keep. You will live. You're not a failure. You're not a disappointment to God. God is not angry with you, disappointed in you. You are righteous, and God sees that. Yeah, Phil?
Invariably, when the child or the cousin or whatever falls away, they try to justify it.
Always, yeah. Always. Yeah, there's always a rationale. And oftentimes they'll blame the religious person in the family. You know, I fell away because you're too judgy. Like, me? Like, did you never know me growing up? Now, we'll go ahead and end on this point here, and I'll let you guys know that the bell just rang. I think the flip side of all this is to look at the unrighteous one and to remember that you don't get to be in God's good graces simply because of a contact righteousness. Like, well, look at my dad. My dad was an elder in the church. Look at all the good deeds my mom did. My mom fed people, and my mom and dad took care of homeless people, and my mom and dad were hospitable. And doesn't that count for something for me? And God says, no, it doesn't. Because if you're wicked, you're wicked. And if you're righteous on your own. All right, so be prepared to go through Lesson 9 out of your workbooks for this Sunday. In whatever capacity we study together, be prepared for Lesson 9. Thank you so much.